This is the second video talking about writing legislation. That's as fancy as an introduction as you're getting. So this is going over bills, resolutions, and constitutional amendments, where to find legislation templates, topic areas that could come up, international, domestic, all that kind of jazz, what to note when writing a bill, and the difference between dockets and agendas and everything surrounding that mess. So quick recap, I know I've already seen this. A bill is anything that when passed will introduce, alter, change something, an existing policy or law. So when passed, something actually changes. In order for that change to happen, you need an enforcement mechanism, a date that it's going to be occurring on, like implementation timeframe, and that's what a bill is. Resolution does not change something when passed. A law does not happen, no implementation date, no enforcement agency. Instead, it's like a suggestion or a paradigm shift, a direction for Congress to go in a lot more generally. Constitutional amendments are a change to the Constitution. This can be an introduction of a clause or an altering to one that already exists. And remember, it needs to be passed by 2/3 of the Congress assembled, not with a simple majority like a bill or resolution. So NSDA has a whole bunch of templates available for you in Google Doc form, Word doc form, I think Pages, like you just use them. And you should be using the NSDA templates for every piece of legislation that you write. If you format legislation incorrectly, it can be really, really difficult to read, to understand what's happening with what it is that you're trying to enforce, because every section has a purpose. Try not to stray from the section outline. Every once in a while, you have a piece of legislation that really needs an additional section. Put it in, but just understand that that shouldn't be what you usually do. That's the exception, not the rule. Before submitting legislation to a tournament, check for typos, check for formatting errors. Coaches, captains, check your students' legislation for formatting errors and typos. Tournaments generally don't reformat submitted legislation. They just allow the author to be scored down by the judges for issues within it. So just put it in a safety net, safeguard it. The title doesn't matter too much. It should sum up what's going on within the legislation. It doesn't need to necessarily take the "a bill to action word article object summarize the solution specifically" format. Do whatever you want. Just make sure it's relevant to the legislation. Sometimes acronyms are fun. There was one a couple nationals ago, it was like it was like DDDDD or JJJJJ or something. I don't remember. It was funny. Section 1 is the policy in a brief or few declarative brief sentences. Really shouldn't be more than 2-3 sentences maximum. It's the gist of what the legislation is trying to do. The person reading it should understand the initiative that would be passed by the end of reading section 1. Section 2 defines any ambiguous terms not obviously clear or technical in nature in section 1. So in section 1, you're explaining the policy. In section 2, you're saying, okay, what specifically does this mean? Section 3 is naming the government agency or agencies that will oversee the enforcement along with a specific enforcement mechanism. So that's a tax, that is reallocation of funding, that is oversight from these departments. That is the government agency, federal government agency, in charge of overseeing and enforcing. Section 3 is where those subsections come into play. So subsections can be used to elaborate further detail. You can have more than one subsection. You can have more than 3 subsections. I've seen them go to G. I think it's unnecessary. If you're taking more than a page to write out a bill, really consider whether every line is necessary. Make sure that the words that you have in there are actually serving a function and are not just there to make it seem more complicated than it needs to be. It doesn't help the debate to be muddled with questions of what the policy is actually doing. Section 4 is going to give the implementation date. So it can be a fiscal year. Remember that fiscal years do not line up with calendar years. It can be like a certain amount of time after passage. So 6 months from passage, this legislation will be implemented. And then the last sentence of any bill is always all laws in conflict with this legislation are hereby declared null and void. That's just saying if anything doesn't add up, it's no longer relevant. So people on the negation can't bring up, but this goes against that law, because you have a clause at the bottom saying, nah, 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 that law is null and void. Here's an example. I believe this was taken from one of the National's dockets. Section 1, every American citizen who obtains a high school diploma or GED will become eligible to receive a full tuition to attend a community college, junior college, or career technical school in the United States. That's stating exactly what the policy is. It's telling you what's happening. Section 2, community college or junior college is defined as any educational institution approved by the Accrediting Commission for Community and Junior Colleges, acronym. That's giving you the definition of any ambiguous terms within the first section. Section 3, the Department of Education will provide enforcement and allocate $60 million in funding. Funding will be provided on a per student basis. That is the enforcement mechanism and the enforcer. So Department of Education with the $60 billion in funding, explaining how that funding is being distributed. 3A, only full-time students enrolled in 12 credit hours or more will be eligible to receive a waiver. So further stipulations. And then any student that drops out or is expelled from their institution will be ineligible to apply for a tuition waiver. That is further stipulations for the legislation. It's like more specific section 1 and explaining more of the grant stuff from section 3. Section 4, implementation will start at the beginning of the 2022-2023 school year. Funding will expire at the conclusion of the 2025-2026 school year. So that's giving like a specific time frame the legislation is being implemented between. A lot of times there won't be end dates for legislation. This is a bit of an oddball in that case, but just keep that in mind. You can have an end date, you cannot have an end date. And then that final section, all laws in conflict with this legislation are hereby declared null and void. The final line, the introduced for congressional debate by the Kansas Flint Hills District, is giving you the author. The author of legislation is given a preferred place by the presiding officer when any of their pieces of legislation are next on the agenda. So when the PO opens the floor on a specific bill, they'll call first for an author. That author, regardless of their precedence or recency, gets to give that authorship speech because they wrote the bill and they're the one who gets to explain it. So having a bunch of your school's bills, resolutions, pieces of legislation on the docket is helpful, because then you get to jump precedence recency regardless of how many speeches you've given or the order in which those speeches were delivered. Next, a resolution. So again, taken from the NSDA, use their templates, don't stray from the good ways that work. A resolution to articles, objects, blah, 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 blah. Title, again, does not matter as much to match that format as it does to describe what it is that you're doing. So don't get caught up at the title. What's different from that bill that we just looked at to this resolution is that there aren't numbered sections. It's cascading whereas clauses. So those whereas clauses can be as numerous as you want them to be. Again, try not to take up more than a page for the entire piece of legislation. But the idea is to establish what is happening in the status quo. So stating the current problem, explaining how large this problem is, explaining some possible harms or benefits of changing it. And then you just keep using whereas clauses to elaborate the foundation of your resolution. Your resolution is what is changing and what you're debating. So resolved at line 10, that the Congress here assembled blank, describe recommendation for the solution, call to action. So we're going to just break that down a little bit slower. Whereas clauses build your foundation. The first one should state the current problem, what needs to be accomplished in one sentence. The second whereas clause describes the scope of the problem explained or introduced in the first whereas clause. The next explains the impacts and harms perpetuated by the current problem, so what's happening in the status quo. And then additional whereas clauses elaborate rationale for the problem that needs to be solved, establishing a foundation of whatever it is that is happening in the status quo. Then that resolved clause is introducing a solution to the foundation that has been set. So the resolved clause could be, let's talk about like, there's a ladybug trying to climb from one leaf to another. Apologies. So let's just use an example for a whereas clause. If there were to be legislation proposing to return the USS Pueblo to the States, hypothetically, those whereas clauses could be used to establish the issue. So whereas the USS Pueblo was taken illegally by, I think, North Korea in 1953, 54, somewhere in that range, describe the scope of the problem. It is the only ship in the US fleet that has not been decommissioned, because in order to be decommissioned, warships need to be on US soil, and it was taken to an adversary's land. The third impact clause could be, it is very important to the US Navy that all ships be returned to the States. And then you can just keep using whereas clauses. Then that resolved clause would be something along the lines of that the Congress here assembled negotiate on behalf of the US Marines, Navy, apologies, Navy, in order to ascertain and decommission the USS Pueblo. Further resolved that the US trades something with North Korea in order to receive this ship. So that would be an example. That example is pulled from 2020 House Finals legislation, which no one wanted to debate because it's a bill about a boat that hasn't. It's not a. There's not a lot of aft ground for that boat other than we want our boat back, and there's not a lot of neg ground for that resolution other than we can't physically get our boat back. So it's I really wanted to debate it, but no one else did, and I got a little bit upset and did an objection to Mosseri's main motion. Anyways, USS Pueblo exists. It's a very small potatoes issue, but it's a good example for a resolution. So what we were doing is establishing the status quo in the whereas clauses. The resolved clause is what it is that you want to change, and then further resolved is any elaboration on the resolved clause that's necessary. They're helpful for the resolved clauses for good debate, just so that you have a lot of content to be talking about within the resolution, but they're not necessary. So keep that in mind when writing them. Example, a resolution to fund offshore wind industry. So all of these whereas clauses, you see there's a number of them, lead to the resolved clause. So whereas the United States has a large offshore wind energy resource that is ready to be utilized, and US shores currently possess a power potential of over 2,000 gigawatts, or nearly double the nation's current electricity usage, and will be able to generate electricity for more than 115 million American households. And offshore wind energy has the potential to deliver large amounts of clean, reliable energy. You know how to read. Pause it, read them, see that these whereas clauses stack upon one another until you get to that final resolved clause. By the Congress here assembled, that the United States shall fund the offshore wind industry to create clean energy. So everything about that was leading up to it. It was saying the US has a potential to utilize this clean energy source, and clean energy is good, and we need electricity, and it'll create jobs, and it will create jobs in shipbuilding and manufacturing, and wildlife and marine ecosystems are positively impacted by offshore wind farms. And we should then, resolved by the Congress here assembled, fund offshore wind energy and create clean energy. They definitely could have, in the resolve clause here, put something about creation of jobs, just because it was introduced in the whereas clauses, and there's grounds, since it was established, to continue to elaborate on that. It's not necessary. You really get to do whatever you want when you write legislation, and that's the resolve clause. So since it's in the whereas clauses, it'll definitely be brought up in the debate, but it's not the policy that would be, it's the intention, but it's not explicitly stated within the resolved clause. Again, Authors at the bottom, author gets preferential speaking order and precedence if they want to. If an author is called and no one stands to be recognized, no one raises their placard to be recognized, then the chair calls on a sponsorship speech. That sponsorship does the same function as an authorship. It introduces the legislation, establishes the affirmative world, but did not write the bill and does not jump precedence or recency in order to give that sponsorship speech. Next, a resolution to amend the Constitution. This is very rarely done correctly with a mix of resolved and sections with the article. Be sure to use the template, please, just so that everyone is aware of what you're talking about. This resolved clause stays the same regardless of whatever constitutional amendment you're making. The title changes. So a resolution to amend the Constitution in order to achieve blank effect. Resolved by 2/3 of the Congress here assembled that, my camera's in the way, that the following article is proposed as an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states within 7 years from the date of its submission by the Congress. Then it's the actual submission. So the article and then the article number that you want to alter. Section 1, state the first part. So keep the 2 hyphens after the article above, since the amendment to the Constitution doesn't get numbered until after it has been ratified. Technicality, a lot of the times people will put the article with like the actual article being amended before those 2 hyphens, just so that it's more easy to find. But that can also go within section 1. And then section 2, Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. An example of constitutional amendment: a resolution to amend the Constitution to end the power to presidentially pardon, resolved by 2/3 of the Congress here assembled. That's just a little blank thing. Article, straightforward, 2 hyphens. Section 1, the President of the United States shall not possess the power to grant pardons or reprieves to any individual. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. You see that it's really, really easy to write constitutional amendments. This one specifically is taking away a right allotted within the Constitution. So it's not citing a specific place in the Constitution that's going to be altered because it exists and is stated in a lot of them. It's saying we're going to take away this power that was granted by the Constitution. And because it's formatted as a constitutional amendment with section 1 explicitly stating the change, it does the same function. So sometimes you'll see a constitutional amendment stating this part of the Constitution will be rewritten to state this, or this amendment will be revoked, or there have been a lot on why is gerrymandering coming to mind? That's not what I'm thinking of. Gerrymandering as well, but voting ratification. There's something with the FEC talking about resolution to amend the Constitution to institute ranked choice voting. That has been common of a topic for the last couple of years. You might see more of it. It depends whether or not people write it and submit it, but a lot of that exists. So just keep your eye out for constitutional amendments. Remember, they are passed by 2/3, not a simple majority. Yeah. Okie dokie. So common topics for legislation divided into 2 sections, international and domestic. Both can be applied for resolutions and bills. Constitutional amendments only are domestic. Constitution only has jurisdiction over the states. Can't constitutionally amend international stuff. As far as common topics go for international, you can have placing or removing sanctions, condemning a country's actions, ending corruption, giving funding to NGOs, non-government organizations, talking about oceans and space, environmental initiatives, that kind of stuff. For domestic, a lot of talk on minimum wage, carbon tax, legalization of class substances. So that's like different narcotics, opioids, stuff like that. Ranked choice voting, body cameras, Supreme Court, student loans, environmental policies, all that jazz within jurisdiction of federal government. Remember, you as Congress are not the leaders of the world. You can propose policies to international organizations, but you don't get to act as a supreme dictator. If you try to do that, you're going to hit a whole bunch of constitutionality, morality, ethical arguments that are difficult to refute because really you are overstepping your powers. So make sure that whatever it is that you're proposing is within the power of Congress to impose and enforce. When writing, don't make airtight legislation. What that means is give the negation a little bit of ground to debate. If you are making something that just does not have negative ground, or really was already proposed and passed by actual Congress by the time, like between submission and the submission to the tournament and when the legislation is being debated, it's really difficult to come up with negation ground, and you want it to be a fairly even debate. Don't write on a topic without reasonable negation ground. So something that's really controversial or offensive at the same time. Don't introduce controversial, offensive legislation that no one wants to advocate for. For example, there was legislation at a tournament that was talking about killing everyone over the age of 60. Some of your judges are going to be over 60. Do you just like think about things before you write them, you know? Try to keep the legislation 1 page in length. That's not a hard maximum. Sometimes you do need to go over it, but a lot of times it's a good idea to try to keep it shorter. Be aware of politics. So what administration is in power? Does the legislation line up with previous initiatives? Does it go against previous actions? If you were to be passing it, would it undo an action that specifically was taken for a purpose that you really don't have a block to? Research legislation before you write it, good idea. And then also use the correct enforcement and be aware of solvency. So if you're telling the Department of Defense to do something that the EPA should be doing, Environmental Protection Agency, non-solvent. DOD probably isn't going to be able to plant more trees unless that's where the tax dollars that add up to military with funding larger than the next 7 nations combined goes to. Planting trees could be probably better for the earth than whatever it is that is currently polluting from DOD. But regardless, make sure that the enforcement agency lines up with what it is that you're trying to do, whatever policy that you're trying to do. All right, note, when you are writing on topics that you are passionate about, it can make the legislation drafting faster and more engaging. If you want to be writing it, it'll come more fluidly. If you can't find inspiration, refer to legislation currently in Congress. That's either like real Congress, or seek to refresh topics from previous tournaments, but be careful not to plagiarize. It's not uncommon for, especially on the national circuit, seeing the same topics written and resubmitted by multiple schools. I've never seen anyone take a penalty for this, but I definitely know that there is plagiarism happening quite rampantly. There have been times where I am looking at legislative dockets for students that I am helping now, 2022, that I have speeches on from like 2018, 2019. Archives exist. I just don't plagiarize. I don't know what penalties exist, but I'm sure that they do, and it can't be helpful. Rewrite it, refresh it, make it more relevant, curtail it to you, make it something you are more passionate about. Don't just copy someone else's work. Difference between dockets and agendas. So the docket is the entire packet of policies distributed by the tournament director. It's often comprised of student written legislation, and the authors are given jumped precedence, recency, and round. The NSDA also releases a monthly docket similar to what students would submit. I don't know who currently writes it. I know that they were soliciting for a new author last year. I haven't heard whether the general opinion is that people like the new legislation that's being proposed. But a lot of the times it'll be local circuits, locals tournaments that are using the NSDA legislation because they don't have student legislation or people who know how to write it. But now you know how to write it, so that'll be helpful. As far as agendas go, the agenda is the order of legislation proposed for debate by a member of the chamber and supported by the majority. So in order for an agenda to be debated, you need the majority of the present members to be in favor of debating it. It's often established during the caucusing period. I don't know why that autocorrected to causing, but it is caucusing. and the authors are sometimes given preferential placement by tournament rules. It's able to be amended in many cases, the agenda, but some tournaments prohibit it because in order to amend the agenda, you do need a suspension of the rules in order to introduce an amendment to blah, blah, blah. You can also table legislation, which is a lot faster way of amending the order that you're going to be debating. But when you table a bill, you don't vote on it. You're just like, okay, we don't want to talk about this right now, maybe later. And usually later doesn't come because you just keep going through the agenda in the order that you were doing. And then at the end of the session, instead of doing a motion to adjourn, you need to do orders of the day and force a vote on whatever legislation was tabled, because it's still technically open because you didn't vote on it yet. So you just do like a quick vote, pass, fail, and then you're done. Alrighty. Second video done, writing legislation. We talked about bills, resolutions, and constitutional amendments, where to find those legislation templates, NSDA website, possible topic areas, specifically international and domestic, what to note when writing bills, and difference between docket and agendas. I hope that this was helpful. As always, have a good day. That's it. Bye.